I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, David Horner. David Horner is an Emeritus Professor in the Strategic and Defence Study Centres at the Australian National University. A graduate of the Royal Military College, Duntoon, he saw the active services in Vietnam and later headed the Army's Land Warfare Study Centre. He's the author of and editor of 38 books on Australian military history, defence and intelligence. As the official historian of the Australian peacekeeping, he was the general editor of the 6-volume series. The first volume of his official history of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation was a joint winner of the Prime Minister Literary Award for History and the UK Intelligence Book of the Year. Wow! I would really like to welcome David here to give us a presentation about all this interesting activities that he's done. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honour to deliver the keynote address to this symposium. And in doing so, I'm conscious that we have some excellent presentations to come dealing with aspects of Brisbane in the Second World War in great detail. In my keynote address, I'll only be able to touch lightly on some of these issues. Rather, I want to give a broad overview which allows the other speakers to expand on the issues. And this photo shows the 7th Division marching through Brisbane on the 8th of August 1944. More than any other state in Australia, the Second World War had a major and lasting impact on Queensland and its residents. And this impact is still felt, even though 80 years have passed since the end of the Second World War. Now, some years ago, when I was a major in the Australian Army, my family and I lived in an army house in Townsville. And we always had trouble growing a garden in the back corner of our property. The area was just heavy gravel. And the reason soon became obvious. Over our back fence was a large, long, straight road with wide verges. It had been the Second World War airstrip. And the gravel in our backyard, of course, was the outer edge of the old airstrip. It was a graphic illustration of the fact that the impact of the Second World War can still be found in many places around the state. And of course, that's our house, and that, of course, if people would... Sorry, I've got to get this back on again. There we are. That, of course, now is a big road called Dalrymple Street in Townsville. And this image emphasises the importance of Brisbane during the war. But the story goes beyond Brisbane. This morning I want to do 3 things. First, I want to explain why the war had a greater impact on Queensland than any other state in Australia. Secondly, I want briefly to describe the different ways that the war affected Queensland. And thirdly, I want to bring attention to the enduring legacy of the war in Queensland. But first, let me start with a few more glimpses of the war's impact. Now, it's hard to imagine that this palm bridge haven has a war history. But Trinity Beach, just north of Cairns, was used as a major training ground for Australian and American troops during the Second World War. And this is a view of Trinity Beach in July 1943, with troops training for an amphibious landing in New Guinea 2 months later. And if you ever visit Cairns, you might come across this memorial to an air crash in March 1945, in which 4 air crew and 7 passengers were killed, and among those killed was the famous Army commander, Major General George Vasey. And there are still reminders of the war scattered around the state, such as this gun emplacement on Magnetic Island. But before we examine the effect on Queensland, we need just a little background as to why Queensland, and more broadly Australia, came under threat in the Second World War. And from the outbreak of the Second World War against Germany in September 1939, which went through to December 1941 when Japan entered the war, the fighting was focused on Europe and the Middle East. Australia put its navy under British control. It sent airmen to assist Britain and raised a volunteer army known as the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, to serve overseas. And at home, the army consisted mainly of part-time militia. Meanwhile, Australia was largely free from immediate threat. However, when Japan entered the war in December 1941, all that changed. Between December 1941 and March 1942, the Japanese conducted a remarkable offensive in which they captured Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, which we now know as Indonesia, most of the Philippines, and landed on the north coast of New Guinea. It was then an Australian territory. With the fall of Singapore, some 18,000 Australian troops marched into captivity. Smaller numbers of Australian troops in Java and on the islands of Ambon, Timor and New Britain were also captured. The war was now closer to Australia. Then on the 19th of February 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin, killing more than 200 people and doing much damage. In mid-March, Japanese aircraft bombed Horn Island in the Torres Strait, and there were further attacks on Darwin. Suddenly, Australia seemed under threat of invasion. The part-time militia went to full-time service, and during 1942, 2 of the AIF divisions returned to Australia. Now, a division is an army formation of about 15,000 men. Now, fortunately for Australia, when the United States joined the war, it completely transformed the strategic situation in the Pacific. The Allies set up 2 major commands to fight the Pacific War. The first covered most of the Pacific Ocean and was commanded by US Navy's Admiral Chester Nimitz, with his headquarters in Honolulu. Just go back a bit. So he's responsible for this Pacific Ocean area there. The second command, called the Southwest Pacific Area, was headed by General Douglas MacArthur, and it included all of Australia, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines and New Guinea. So it's this area there. And the red line there shows the extent of the Japanese advance. MacArthur arrived in Australia in mid-March 1942 and set up his headquarters in Melbourne. And MacArthur would work closely with the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin. American aircraft started to arrive and MacArthur was allocated some American ships. MacArthur therefore put the American officers in charge of the joint Australian and American naval and air forces. However, MacArthur's army consisted of some 12 Australian divisions and only 2 American divisions. And they were starting to arrive in Australia. So, Australian General Sir Thomas Blamey, the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army, was also appointed Commander of MacArthur's land forces. But it would take a while before these forces could mount a counter-offensive against the Japanese. In the meantime, as Japanese forces crept closer to Australia, the first task was to defend Australia. To the Australians and the Americans, it seemed that a Japanese invasion was a distinct possibility. We now know that at this stage the Japanese had not intended to invade Australia. Rather, the Japanese wanted to cut Australia off from the United States so that Australia could not be used as a base for an Allied counter-offensive. The Japanese therefore wanted to capture Port Moresby on the south coast of Papua. Let's go back. Now, the Japanese also wanted to capture the Solomon Islands and push south to Vanuatu and Fiji. So So they want to come down through here. Now that arrow is not where they were going to invade, it's just just a bombing attack. The Australians and the Americans did not know these Japanese plans, and it was very reasonable for them to expect that the Japanese wanted to land in Australia. Queensland was potentially in the front line, as shown by the school children digging trenches at Ascot State School in Brisbane in case of an enemy air attack. An Australian division was deployed to Townsville and some civilians were evacuated from North Queensland. There was also concern about foreigners living in Australia. About 5,000 Italian men were interned, including 1,500 who were British subjects, many of whom came to Australia as children. The internment hit Queensland sugar communities especially hard, with hundreds of men in the farming town, say of Ingham, rounded up in case they helped the Japanese if they landed. Both because of the possibility of invasion and because troops could be sent more easily to New Guinea from Queensland, Allied troops were soon concentrated in Queensland. 2 Australian infantry divisions moved to Queensland from the southern states, and 2 American divisions were located near Rockhampton to train and prepare for operations. As well as troops being deployed from southern Australia to Queensland, military units were also raised in the state, and these formed the 5th Division that was deployed to Townsville. When troops were needed to defend Milne Bay in Papua, one of the division's brigades was sent from Townsville to Milne Bay. The Allied command was also concerned about the security of the Torres Strait Islands. And to deal with this threat, local Indigenous people were recruited to join the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. And due to the racial policies at the time, all the officers and senior non-commissioned officers in the battalion were white Australians, while the Torres Strait Islanders originally received only 1/3 of the pay of the white soldiers of equal rank. The danger to Queensland was emphasised by the Battle of the Coral Sea. At the beginning of May 1942, a Japanese invasion fleet, supported by another naval force with 2 aircraft carriers, intended to sail around the southeastern tip of New Guinea and land troops at Port Moresby. To the Australians, it seemed that the Japanese could have been heading for Queensland. The Japanese fleet was met by an American naval force with 2 aircraft carriers, and in the ensuing battle, aircraft from the aircraft carriers attacked the opposing aircraft carriers. It was the first time in naval history that a battle had been fought at sea in which neither side's ships saw each other. The Americans lost an aircraft carrier and had one badly damaged. The Japanese also lost a small carrier and had a large one damaged. It was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a major strategic defeat as they called off their invasion of Port Moresby. For the Australian and American operations in New Guinea, Queensland provided the most suitable support base. The US Air Force was reluctant to base its bombers in Port Moresby, where they were vulnerable to attack from Japanese aircraft at Rabaul in New Britain. There was also limited logistic support in New Guinea. The US Air Force therefore built a series of airfields in North Queensland at Mareeba on the Athens Tableland, Charters Towers, and in and around Townsville. And this is the crew of an American B-17 bomber at Mareeba. Townsville became a key Air Force base. The city was host to more than 50,000 American and Australian troops and aircrew, and it became a major staging point for battles in the Southwest Pacific. The RAAF established a major headquarters in Townsville, and its aircraft were based at Garbutt Airfield. The American 5th Bomber Command was also based at Townsville, and soon Townsville was crisscrossed with 7 airfields. And the image there shows aircraft lined up on Garbutt Airfield. The Japanese responded to these air attacks, and in July 1942, Japanese flying boats carried out 4 raids against Townsville. There was little damage and no casualties except for one child injured near Mossman. One interesting unit based in Townsville was a small RWF radio intercept station. The unit was camouflaged to look like an ordinary house. Only the steps and the tanks were real. All the other features, such as windows, railings and the trellis, were painted onto the walls of reinforced concrete. A little known incident was the so-called Townsville Mutiny. About 600 African-American troops from a US engineer battalion were stationed at a base outside of Townsville called Kelso Field, shown here. And with some justification, they felt that they were badly treated by the US Higher Command. On the 22nd of May 1942, the black troops began firing machine guns at the tents of white officers, resulting in an 8-hour siege. At least one person was killed and dozens were severely injured. Townsville was also a major port supporting the war effort. There was always a danger that ships leaving southern Australian ports heading north might be sunk by Japanese submarines. To avoid this, troops bound for New Guinea were sent north by rail to Townsville, where they joined ships for the relatively short voyage to Port Moresby. Other shipping came north inside the Great Barrier Reef, where they were more protected from possible Japanese attack. Mines were laid in the reef to provide additional protection, and after the war it took 3 years to clear more than 1,800 mines, and the Australian corvette HMAS Warrnambool was sunk in September 1947 after striking a mine. 4 sailors were killed and 25 were wounded. The danger from submarines was emphasised on the 14th of May 1943 when a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank the Australian hospital ship Centaur off Moreton Island, with the loss of 268 lives. The ship had been appropriately lit and marked to indicate that it was a hospital ship, and its sinking was regarded as a war crime, an atrocity. It was the single greatest loss of life resulting from a submarine attack in Australian waters. Now, Brisbane played a major role during the war as the location of various headquarters. In 1942, Brisbane was Australia's 3rd largest city with a population of about 344,000 people. But it was also very much a sleepy country town. It was isolated, not only from the rest of Australia, but from the rest of Queensland, with railways the main connecting link. And the war brought immense changes. On the 22nd of December 1941, an American convoy, including the troop transport, the USS Republic, you can see it there, arrived in Brisbane with 4,600 personnel bound for the Philippines. The troops never made it to the Philippines and they remained in Queensland. And the numbers of Americans continued to grow. Many buildings and facilities around Brisbane were given over to be used by the American military. Brisbane found it difficult to cope as the population increased by 80,000 during the peak period. The city was fortified, schools were closed, brownouts enforced, and many families sold up and moved inland. Wartime Brisbane was defined by racial segregation of African American servicemen, prohibition and sly grog, crime and jazz ballrooms. In July 1942, General MacArthur moved the headquarters of the Southwest Pacific area from Melbourne to Brisbane so that he'd be closer to the operational area. And he set up his headquarters in the AMP building in Queen Street in Brisbane. It became quite an attraction for Brisbane residents to observe MacArthur travelling from his hotel to his headquarters in his limousine every day. MacArthur had his headquarters in Brisbane from July 1942 until August 1944, when he moved to Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea. General Blamey set up his headquarters at the newly completed main building of the University of Queensland, where we are at the moment. Not in this building, of course. Another organisation to move to Brisbane was the top secret signals intercept and code breaking unit called Central Bureau. It was located at 21 Henry Street. You can see it there. Now, Brisbane was the site of a violent clash between American military personnel and Australian servicemen and civilians, which became known as the Battle of Brisbane. And there are several reasons for this clash. Through their canteens, known as the PX, the Americans had access to merchandise such as alcohol and cigarettes, etc., a whole lot of things which were not available to Australians. Hotels were only allowed to serve alcohol twice a day for 1 hour at a time of their choosing, leading to large numbers of Australian servicemen rushing from one hotel to the next and then drinking as quickly as they could before they moved on to the next one. US military pay was considerably higher than that of the Australian military, and US military uniforms were seen as more appealing. American servicemen were popular with Australian women, and indeed many Americans ended up marrying Australian women, which was greatly resented by the Australian soldiers. On the 26th and 27th of November 1942, violent clashes took place between Australian and American servicemen on the streets of Brisbane. By the time the violence had been quelled, one Australian soldier was dead and hundreds of Australian and American servicemen had been injured. There were allegations that the American military police were heavy-handed. The units involved in the riots were relocated out of Brisbane. The military police strength was increased. There were joint Australian and American patrols. The Australian canteen was closed and the American PX was relocated. Now, Brisbane fulfilled another wartime function as it was selected, along with Fremantle, as a major base for US submarines operating in the Western Pacific. Brisbane proved highly suitable. It was also out of range of Japanese aircraft based in New Guinea. The first of 11 submarines arrived in the Brisbane River in April 1942, and by the end of the month, 4 on active war patrols. Brisbane became a major submarine maintenance facility, of which 89 submarines were dry docked for repairs over a 3-year period. Now, it needs to be remembered that the submarines came directly under the control of Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii and were not under MacArthur. And they played a major role in the defeat of Japan. In late 1942, the Japanese were pushed back to the north coast of Papua, where Australian and American soldiers fought a bitter campaign to defeat the Japanese lodgements. The Australians incurred considerable casualties from the enemy and even larger numbers from malaria. General Blamey knew that if the Australians were to conduct a successful campaign in New Guinea, they would need to develop more expertise in jungle warfare, and they needed to be trained in areas that were like New Guinea, but not subject to malaria. And he settled on the Atherton Tableland in the Great Dividing Range inland from Cairns. Now, Cairns is 1,390 kilometres by air from Brisbane, but it's only 845 kilometres from Cairns to Port Moresby. And already, the Americans had established an airfield at Mariba, where American bomber and Australian fighter squadrons were based. The tableland was large enough to accommodate many soldiers in tented camps, and there were large areas of rainforest that were suitable for jungle training. But the climate on the tableland was not as trying as on the coast around Cairns. Within a few months, 3 Australian infantry divisions were in training. The picture there shows General MacArthur visiting the 9th Division at Atherton in July 1943. More than 100,000 troops were based at 160 sites scattered across the area, centred on towns such as Mariba Atherton, Herberton, Mount Garnet and Ravenshoe. The Atherton War Cemetery, the third largest in Queensland, contains 164 graves of soldiers and airmen who either died from wounds received in New Guinea or from training accidents or from illness. Army units would travel down to Trinity Beach near Cairns to practice amphibious landings from Australian and American landing ships. When the time came to deploy to New Guinea, the troops would board their ships at Cairns for the relatively short voyage to New Guinea. The North Queensland area therefore played a vital role in the Second World War. Now, as well as training in the rainforests on the Atherton tableland, the Australian Army also established a special jungle training centre at Canungra in the hills behind the Gold Coast, which apart from Southport in those days was little more than a series of shacks. And the troops also trained in the Lamington National Park on the Queensland-New South Wales border. The centre closed after the war but reopened in the 1950s when Australian soldiers were fighting in Malaya during the Malayan emergency. All the soldiers who served in Vietnam had to complete an intensive jungle warfare course before they were deployed, and I certainly did. The centre, renamed the Land Warfare Centre, is still a major army training centre. The Second World War has had a lasting impact on Queensland. Townsville is still a garrison town. Laverack Barracks is the home for the Regular Army's 3rd Brigade. The RAAF base at Townsville, at the old wartime Garwood Airfield, is home to more than 1,500 military personnel. The Torres Strait Light Infantry has been perpetuated as the 51st Far North Queensland Regiment, with its headquarters at Cairns. It conducts reconnaissance patrols across the Cape York Peninsula. A high proportion of the regiment's personnel are Indigenous Australians. Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane, known as Gallipoli Barracks, is a major army base. It is home to units of the 7th and the 11th Infantry Brigades, the 16th Aviation Brigade and the headquarters of the 1st Division. It's one of the largest army bases in the country. Australia's largest operational air base is at Amberley, near Ipswich. It's home to squadrons of Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, air tankers, transport aircraft and big C-17 Globemasters. Now, the large number of Defence Force bases and units in Queensland is both a legacy of the bases established in the Second World War and a recognition that the same reasons that resulted in the deployment of military forces to the area in the Second World War still apply today. One of the most enduring legacies of the Second World War concerns migration from the southern states and the development of tourism in Queensland. Before the war, few Australians travelled from their own state to another state. During the war, tens of thousands of soldiers from all over Australia were deployed to Queensland, where they were exposed to the state's attractions, and they vowed to return after the war as tourists. And many of these tourists then decided that they wanted to stay in Queensland. And Brisbane is a case in point. About 95 years ago, in 1930, when this photo of Brisbane was taken, Adelaide, with a population of 324,000, was slightly larger than Brisbane. However, the population of the Brisbane metropolitan area is now almost twice that of Adelaide, and the population within an hour's drive of Brisbane is almost 3 times that of Adelaide. Now, not all that development can be attributed to the war, but certainly the Second World War was responsible for bringing Queensland to the notice of thousands of young men who otherwise would not have visited the state. And some of the evidence is fast disappearing. The searchlight bunker on Bribey Island is struggling to survive against the waves and the weather. Now, clearly in this short address this morning, I could only touch briefly many of the ways in which war came to Queensland. However, I hope I've provided a foundation for the more detailed stories that will come out of the symposium. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that. Lots of things, and also particularly the northern part of your Townsville and the Cairns and things like that, yeah. Because then it's all a bit parochial. We were thinking about Brisbane, yeah. So thank you for that clarification. Really interesting. Any questions for David? Simon.
Professor Horner, you alluded very briefly to a siege in Townsville where someone died. Was that like the Battle of Brisbane? Was that a similar?
It was not quite the same as the Battle of Brisbane, because the Battle of Brisbane was between Americans and Australians, whereas the fighting in Townsville was the black American troops really mutinying against the Americans. I couldn't mention it because I'll try and keep the story short, but the whole thing was suppressed. And one of the reasons it was suppressed is because there was a visitor from an American Congress coming by the name of Lyndon Johnson. And they tried to suppress the story, but of course the story is known now.
Well, on that theme, I might have missed it, but did you mention the Aboriginal Australian
I didn't mention the Aboriginal Australians, I mentioned the Torres Strait Islanders. I'll mention that a bit more in a second, but we didn't really raise Aboriginal units, but although the unit formed in Northern Territory had a lot of Aboriginal people in it. But essentially, Aboriginal Australians, First Nation people, just joined the Australian Army and became part of the, if you like, the normal Australian Army. Whereas the Torres Strait Island unit was different. And a colleague of mine by the name of Bob Hall, if I can bore you with a little story, did his PhD, and he did his PhD on the Torres Strait Island Battalion. And he discovered that they had not been paid sufficiently. And he arranged for them many years later to receive pay from the Australian government to make up for that shortfall of pay that they had received. So you can imagine he's a bit of a hero among the local people there.
Thank you. I would like to now invite you for coffee, tea, and once again, join me in thanking David for this excellent keynote speech. Okay, coffee, tea on your right hand.